The geopolitical rupture witnessed in January 2026 is not merely a kinetic realignment of borders, but the violent compilation of a code that has been executing in the shadows of the deep web for nearly a decade, where the physical dismantling of the post-World War II order is simply the final rendered output of a far more pervasive algorithmic war that prioritizes digital sovereignty over human rights and resource control over multilateral consensus. What the public perceives as Operation Absolute Resolve was not initiated by the boots on the ground in Caracas, but rather by a synchronized zero-day cascade that dissolved Venezuela's digital borders 72 hours prior to the first rotor turning on a Black Hawk helicopter. The operational reality of the 21st century demands we acknowledge that physical invasion is obsolete without the pre-kinetic saturation of the target's cyber-physical systems, which in this specific theater involved the systematic injection of polymorphic malware into the SCADA systems managing Venezuela's national power grid, effectively severing the command and control loop of the Maduro regime before they could authorize a defensive posture. This is the dawn of the splinternet era, where the global information superhighway is being chopped into heavily fortified intranets, and the U.S. strategy now relies on the weaponization of the TCP/IP stack to enforce the Trump corollary, which views the Western Hemisphere not just as a geographic zone, but as a latency-free network topology that must be scrubbed of Chinese and Russian packet inspection hardware. The failure of the S-300VM and Buk M2E air defense systems was not a result of pilot skill, but a catastrophic failure of their fire control algorithms induced by U.S. Cyber Command's deployment of airborne electronic warfare platforms that broadcasted spoofed telemetry data directly into the logic gates of the Russian-made radar arrays, causing the system to hallucinate targets that did not exist while blinding them to the F-35s that were practically sitting on their digital doorsteps. This event signifies the total obsolescence of legacy hardware-defined defense in an era of software-defined warfare where a missile battery is only as effective as the patch level of its operating system and the ability of its AI to distinguish between a signature-managed B-21 Raider and a flock of birds is the only metric that matters. The apprehension of Maduro was guided by an autonomous swarm of high-altitude loitering munitions utilizing gate recognition analysis and thermal distinctiveness signatures to pinpoint the leadership node within the hardened compound, drastically reducing the latency between identification and extraction. This is the terrifying precision of algorithmic warfare, where the decision to engage is processed by a neural network trained on petabytes of surveillance data, effectively removing the human hesitation from the kill chain. Moving northward, the Arctic ultimatum regarding Greenland is less about the surface ice and more about the subsurface dominance of the fiber optic cables that traverse the GIUK gap, which serve as the central nervous system of transatlantic data exchange. The U.S. acquisition strategy is driven by a necessity to secure the rare earth elements like neodymium and dysprosium, which are not just rocks, but the fundamental building blocks of the microchips that power the AI swarms and the guidance systems of the very missiles used in Caracas, creating a closed-loop supply chain that excludes Chinese state-owned enterprises from the hardware layer of Western defense. The threat to close the GIUK gap is a threat to sever the data link, preventing Russian submarines from tapping into the backbone of Western financial trading and communication networks, essentially blinding the Northern Fleet by denying them access to the electromagnetic spectrum in the North Atlantic. This creates a scenario where NATO's Article 5 is being stress-tested against the reality of resource realism, where the alliance is no longer about mutual defense but about securing the rights to the server farms and cooling systems that will host the next generation of artificial intelligence models. As we pivot to the Arabian Peninsula, the dissolution of the STC and the fracture between Saudi Arabia and the UAE is a direct consequence of the weaponization of digital currencies and the decentralized finance protocols that have allowed proxies to move value across borders without touching the SWIFT system. The fragmentation of the Sunni monolith is being exacerbated by information warfare campaigns that utilize deep-fake technology and bot farms to amplify grievances between Abu Dhabi and Riyadh, turning a geopolitical disagreement into a digitally fueled existential crisis. The false normalization of the Red Sea shipping routes is perhaps the most dangerous deception of all, a narrative constructed by algorithmic trading bots that are pricing in a stability that does not exist while autonomous underwater vehicles and smart naval mines equipped with acoustic signature recognition lie in wait for the tonnage to return. The shipping industry is walking into a data void where the AIS signals of merchant vessels are being spoofed and manipulated to lure them into kill boxes designated by Houthi, targeting algorithms that have been refined through machine learning models supplied by Iranian advisors. This security vacuum is being filled by a chaotic mix of private military contractors and autonomous defensive systems that operate without a central command structure, creating a high-frequency war zone where engagement decisions are made in microseconds based on sensor fusion data that may or may not be accurate. The economic superstructure is bleeding into this kinetic chaos as the weaponization of the U.S. dollar forces adversaries to accelerate the development of central bank digital currencies that operate on permissioned blockchains immune to U.S. Treasury sanctions. The seizure of Venezuelan assets is a smart contract execution on a global scale, proving that in 2026 property rights are conditional on the cryptographic keys held by the hegemon. The flight to neutral assets like gold is being digitized with tokenized gold reserves, becoming the new settlement layer for the axis of resistance, allowing them to bypass the dollar entirely and trade energy resources on a peer-to-peer basis that is opaque to Western intelligence agencies. This creates a bifurcated global economy where one sphere operates on the transparent high surveillance rails of the Western financial system, and the other operates in the dark pools of decentralized exchanges and state-sponsored crypto laundering operations. The supply chain turmoil is no longer just about logistics, but about data integrity as hackers target the manifest systems of major shipping lines, injecting phantom cargo and deleting critical inventory records to sow chaos in the just-in-time delivery models that the global economy relies on. The European theater's mutation into a coalition of the willing represents the decentralization of security architecture, where the monolithic command structure of NATO is replaced by a modular plug-and-play alliance system that allows nations to deploy cyber-kinetic effects without the consensus latency of a 30-nation treaty organization. This coalition of the willing is essentially a distributed denial-of-service attack on Russian strategic planning, overwhelming Moscow's ability to calculate a coherent response by presenting a fragmented and unpredictable attack surface. The deployment of British and French troops is less about holding ground and more about establishing forward-deployed cyber intelligence nodes that can feed real-time targeting data into the autonomous weapons systems that are turning the Ukrainian steppe into a proving ground for the post-human future of warfare. Ultimately, the events of early 2026 describe a world where the distinction between peace and war has been erased by the continuous low-level hum of cyber espionage and algorithmic destabilization, where the capture of a president or the purchase of an island are simply the physical manifestations of a digital victory that was secured months in advance through the quiet manipulation of zeros and ones. The great de-risking is actually the great firewalling of the West, a retreat into a digitally gated community where access to the network is the ultimate privilege, and exclusion means not just economic poverty, but kinetic annihilation at the hands of an autonomous swarm that knows your biometric signature better than you know yourself.